Hey there, everybody. It is week 5, and since we switched from a synchronous meeting to an asynchronous meeting, I am going to do this by video this week instead, so you're still getting the instruction without having to be co-present with me, which is one of the nice things about the instructional design we have here. So what I'm going to do is record this whole thing so it's all part of the same PowerPoint, but I'm going to break it into pieces that align to each of the activities. So just to review for this week, in lieu of the class meeting, first activity I'm going to talk about is what was your instructional design model that was it validated by a research study? Second, I'll talk about what kinds of research occurs with instructional designs that result from these kinds of models. And I will talk about 3 in particular that were based on different instructional design models that some of them have been done just this year. In fact, one's being defended tomorrow, and another one's mine from my dissertation a long time ago. But it was very much rooted in instructional design models. And then third, I will talk about the applied instructional design model explanation for where I'm at with the tech, ethics, and environment course at this point with the design work. And then last, or second last, I will review assignment 3, which will be due the week after next. And I will review what I'd like you to do on your midterm reflection. So that is where we are. So first, was your instructional design model validated by a research study? What I'd like you to do for this is in a Word document, not a PDF or something else, because I sometimes like to grab your documents and do line edits in there so that I can model corrections to things. Sometimes I just like to do comments. So I like to have that option. If I get a PDF, I will convert it to a Word document, but it's going to be annoying. So please just give me a Word document. I know that even in Google Docs, you can export as Word document. So please do that. So I'd like you to reflect on your instructional design model and your second investigation activity that you did. So first, tell me, was your instructional design model validated by one or more studies? Did someone actually test this? Also, critique it. Do you think that validation testing was actually adequate? Do you find the model trustworthy as a result of the work that's been done with it? One of the things that I always found interesting was the discussions with my faculty when I was in graduate school, because they knew the people who had built a lot of these models, and there were some very popular models out there because the people that created them were good speakers and had a lot of grant money, so they ran around speaking about their models a lot, but the models themselves often didn't make logical sense and had very little validation. So they're pushing them even though they knew that they hadn't really validated them. So my faculty at Indiana, University of Houston, would both be in a mood to question when we would talk about certain models, and you should be too. If your model was not validated, do you have a problem with its lack of validation? Do you think it's so intuitive that it doesn't need to be? Or if it's overly intuitive and super simplistic, is it really a model? Does it actually offer enough guidance for us to design a successful instruction as a result of using it? There's always concerns if you've got a model that is too few steps, because it may not tell us enough about what we need to do. It may be just too broad. So that's something else to think about. And if it has not been validated, tell me how you think it could be validated. These are all the types of thinking that we do as academics as we write articles. We critique and we offer other options. It's not enough to just complain about stuff. We also need to talk about how we might fix things. There is a Dropbox in the week called in week 5 activity 1 turn in Dropbox in the week 5 module. So you'll just turn that in there. Should not take you too long. I'd say no more than a page or two in terms of this, because you've already written it up, but I want you to just reflect on it. Really tell me what you think, boil it down. But also get further on into thinking about what you think and how you think the problem could be overcome if there is a problem. So second activity, what kinds of research occurs with instructional designs resulting from these models? So this is a question that I get, and hopefully you have already uncovered a lot of research that's out there, and that's actually really the focus of your next activity for this class that's due week 7, is looking at the research that happens with the designs that are the outputs of this. Did somebody follow the design model and then conduct a study on it? What are the different types of studies that you can do? Are there a lot of them? Yeah, there's tons of different aspects that you can study. You don't have to study literally everything. You can just study one aspect of an instructional design model or a treatment that resulted from the model that you created to see if people learn more. Or you could just look at the usability of the outputted content that came from following the model. There are so many different things that you can do. You can look at the user experience and figure out, hey, did they have a good experience, a bad experience? How we can make this better. There's a lot that we can do here. It doesn't just have to be run some t-tests and see pre-post, but sometimes we can run pre-post tests and see if people learn more as a result of our instructional design. And if it will move to the next one, I can talk about that. So first one I want to talk about is my own. It's the oldest. It is very old now, but honestly, I've read a lot of these and read a lot of books on learning games and have edited a lot of books on learning games and read a lot of articles that have been published and not published. And unfortunately, most of them still aren't as detailed as this one that I did a very long time ago, which is why I bring it up. And I know that there's still a lot of interest in learning games and simulations. And this was one of the first and most robust studies of a learning game created from instructional design model, going all the way from the beginning to all the way to the end, that involved pilot study, improvement, narrative design of immersive qualities of gaming. I incorporated both the ADDIE model as a broad step-based process, as well as problem-based learning model, specifically anchored instruction, to build this out. And it was a lot of work. It was an insane amount of work. And beyond just testing to see if kids learned more as a result of it and were better writers at the other end, I also wanted to see what their experience was. So it was not just quantitative, it was also a qualitative study. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to talk about the quant stuff today, because the other two studies that I'm going to talk about are more focused on qualitative methods anyway. So with Anytown, you can see the graphics in the corner there. Very old school, late 90s, early 2000s graphics, because we were based on an NSF grant. And while they gave us a lot of money, there weren't a lot of great options. Second Life existed at the time, but it was brutally expensive and hard to develop in because it didn't really have a back-end engine for doing the kinds of conditional logic we needed to build effectively what is an adventure game, which is what this was. That is what I designed it as, following things like The Seventh Guest, King's Quest, and those kinds of things, where Based on your choices, the dialogue of different characters in the space would change. But also in some instances, we would have the environment change, although that was limited because the engine that we were using called Active Worlds was limited. So part of this was we had to structure the activities that the students did in a way where there were both learning games and entertainment games, because while students were waiting for feedback through the system from their instructor, I wanted them to have something to do that was engaging and motivating, and try to get them to do additional practice on their own just because it was fun to do and they wanted to learn more about the mystery and the adventure in this space. So in part one and part two, there were different pathways they could take. If you took one pathway, it might cut another one off, but it might reopen later. Um, if you had completed a certain task, like a writing quest that went to the newspaper editor, it would be in the queue to be read and reviewed. The teacher would role play as the editor to give feedback. And while that was happening, you could run off and do some other quests that were suggested to you through the system, because the dialogue would change because you had met particular conditions. And each of the stories was interrelated in all of this based on a much larger story that was tied into the overall Quest Atlantis narrative that I was writing, because I was responsible for the narrative of all of Quest Atlantis for that 2-year period that I worked there. So then it tied into the bigger Space Quest types of stuff so that it made more logical sense, hopefully. Who knows? But there were a lot of non-player characters who would talk to the kids and give them more information. There were a lot of interactive puzzles where they were doing codes and ciphers and things like that. The story would open up over time as they uncovered clues and solved different quests. And again, they could make choices about the trajectories that they took. The narrative was decentralized so that each different part could be both compartmentalized, but also brought back together in a meaningful way, so that if I was doing this particular quest line, my whole story was that about the mad scientist creating starfruit grape soda. But it also asked them to interrogate the story in the world around them in the way that newspaper reporters do, because that was part of the goal, was to help them develop this kind of identity that they were taking on, which was a newspaper reporter, to help build context and anchor the instruction in a meaningful way around real world types of things that they might experience every day. I myself was a newspaper reporter for the Western Michigan Herald. I was also news editor and sports editor, and did a bunch of stuff there. Also was a stringer for the Kalamazoo Gazette for a little while. And so I was very familiar with this from journalism. But it was also appropriate because we were asking them to do descriptive stories and follow a 6-stage writing process that mirrors the type that we use in language arts and reading education models. So not only did I use anchored instruction, problem-based learning model, I also used common language education models and bridged those together where they fit best. So all of this was, of course, guided by a professor of language education, in addition to my learning technologies and learning sciences people on my committee. So, and I was a language arts and reading teacher, so I already had a master's in that, and I followed all of those components that led to the missions that the students did, and it was kind of fun. But that also meant that there was a ridiculous amount of stuff to study, and you cannot study everything. Believe me, I tried. So some of the quests were pretty simple. These were for 4th graders. All the directions were written at a 4th grade level. We also wrote them based on how the kids told us they wanted them written when we did the pilot study, because we had them done differently originally. And when we met with the kids afterwards, we're like, all right, what works and what doesn't? Is it logical? Does it make sense? And so we actually reconstructed the layout of these based on their feedback. And part of what they asked us for was more direction about where to go because they got lost easily in the virtual world space. So the first quest, what happened to Learning Cabin or the Burning Cabin? You'd follow the editor-in-chief's directions and you have to write your descriptive news story. You had to explore the old log cabin burning in the southeast of City Hall, next to the fountain. So we told them it's in the southeast. They could look at their map and see southeast. They could see where City Hall was. They could also see where the fountain was. So it gave them navigation waypoints. Look for any clues to help figure out who might be responsible and talk to Sheriff Crenshaw for that next quest. So there were also objects all over the cabin that they could click on to get more information that would help them try to figure out what was happening in the space. So they were engaged in some critical thinking, which is one of the goals of problem-based learning. And to turn in, what are you going to turn in? 4 to 5 paragraph news story. So we gave them specifics about what we wanted them to include, including just a description of the cabin, description of the clues, description of information that they learned from the people that they talk to, and that they have to talk to Sheriff Crenshaw. Part of the reason that we told them that is because in the pilot, the kids would just wander around and look around the town because they were just interested in exploring. And then they would complain that the quest didn't start and they didn't know what to do because they didn't follow the directions to speak with Sheriff Crenshaw. So we highlighted and set that off in the design here of just the directions, because the design of the directions themselves can be a point of study in your instructional design, which you'll see in the next one. It's important that they talk to the people in the town to discover what can help them in their writing. So in addition to all of this, we wanted them to know that the people in town were resources who would also give them little bits of information about improvements to descriptive writing that they could do. So what are some resources? Well, we told them very specifically that they needed to talk to the people in the newspaper because often they would ignore them, that there were people in the school and the library who also had a lot of information to provide if they went to them. And then specific things about the writing process and who to talk to about those things so that they wouldn't get lost and they could always come back to the quest and reread this stuff, or they could write down this information in the field note guide that we gave them. So they actually had a physical paper notebook that was a reporter's notebook that I actually have blank versions of still up here in the office somewhere. But just to give them a lot of direction. And this part of the goal with this design was what the teachers told us, and one of my biggest frustrations as a middle school teacher and even working in elementary and high school, was kids would ask me to repeat directions over and 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 over again because they weren't attending to the information at the time that I gave it. So we wanted to use the technological system to embed the directions in the same way you do in a video game, so that if somebody gets lost or they can't figure out what's going on, it provides them with clues and information that they can go back to and use the system for what the system is good for, which is repeating the directions. And that is supposed to take a lot of the burden off the teacher, so the teacher can spend more time giving feedback, and feedback is what leads to improved learning and writing, according to the research that we had at the time. So all of that to say is I spent a lot more time thinking all this stuff through because I had more time. But there was a reason for every instructional decision that was made in the development of the game. Then we looked at, all right, we needed the treatment class, which received the instructional design, which was the game. They used it for 7 lab periods, and then they could use it outside of class, but according to the metadata, they did not. Most of them did not have access. This was in 2005, 2006. Back then, it was surprising how many kids did not have computers at home. And then we had a comparison class who they were following the same standards that we used. So we actually followed the TECs, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, for the language arts and reading stuff that we're looking at, as well as the Indiana Core 40 and Common Core at the time. And so the teacher was covering the same concepts in class, but without the game. And we wanted to see which group performed better. And the two groups, I had to sit in the classroom and watch them for a month so that when I talked to my committee, they could confirm that both groups were approximately similar. It was excessive. They made me film it. It was the kind of stuff that I would never do TO. It was a lot. So first thing we did is we wanted to see if the amount of time that the teacher spent answering questions was greater for the treatment teacher or the comparison teacher. And I had to sit there and basically track all of the time during those periods that I was observing. We had to film it and then do timestamps to check how long each was spending answering questions during the instruction. And when we ran the t-test, there were statistically significant differences between the two, and that the treatment teacher who used Anytown spent a lot less time answering questions and giving directions. So that was one of the things we hoped for. So that is one way that we can do research with it. And we had a second hypothesis that there would be more voluntary student writing activity. And so the comparison teacher also offered extra credit and extra writing activity that the students could do in her class. However, in the Anytown class, 26 students did extra activities versus 0 in the comparison class. So that was statistically significant, but didn't need to run the t-test because 26 to 0 is going to be significant. And then in the third hypothesis, we said that standardized student achievement would be significantly increased in the treatment group versus comparison. And so we did a pre-writing test and had the same group of teachers evaluate their descriptive writing before, and then after they did it again, and it was the same group of teachers evaluating their writing. Now, mind you, this was after only 7 uses of Anytown. And what we found is that they're with an alpha set at 0.05, the repeated measures ANOVA with Bonferroni adjustment showed that scores on proximal post-test were differed significantly from the pre-test scores. It says it's in press. It has not been in press in a very long time. I grabbed this off of old slides because I was in a hurry. That was published in 2008. So it improved writing, which was the goal. They spent more time on task, therefore they should do better with their writing. So that is one way that you can conduct research on instructional design. Second, would be looking at the usability of a course that results from instructional design or specific instructional design principles like multimedia principles for learning. So Dr. Surrency, who graduated in May, she graduated in December. She did her study at a university in Florida where she works on 3 different courses in Canvas that were designed with different levels of inclusion of Merrill's multimedia principles and navigation signposting to see what the usability differences were across the 3 to try to figure out kind of what the sweet spot is in terms of inclusion of multimedia and navigation signposting for 3 different versions of an online course, same content across all 3. And so wanted to figure out which one was going to work best by having students do what's called a think aloud protocol for usability testing. This is something I've written about a couple times, mostly with educational gaming, but Monica used think aloud protocol in order to look at courses in an LMS, which was great. And so she had a very structured protocol with questions about each thing that she wanted the student to do, each click they were doing. And so she spent a huge amount of time effectively interviewing through this think aloud protocol to get feedback on their experience to figure out which version had the best design and try to learn, even with the best design, what else in the media principles and navigation principles could be improved. So Dr. Cerncy reviewed the participants' responses and looked at each component. 2 other people, including myself, reviewed the coding that Monica did. She used a qualitative tool. She either used Deduce or In Vivo. I think it might have been In Vivo. So part of the goal was to not just understand which one is best. You could probably just do rating scale and figure out which one they like best from a usability perspective. But by doing the qualitative research, Monica was able to figure out why they preferred each of these and what made one better than another. And that was a big benefit to the outcome and leads to better instructional designs in the future by using multimedia and navigation principles better in courses going forward. And the last one here that I'm going to talk about in this section is learning product user experience testing. So Dr. Zain Ali, who is defending his dissertation tomorrow afternoon, developed a product for improving leadership skills. So learning about what one needs to improve and guiding learners about leadership competencies. That was Zane's goal, was to develop a 360 platform that is usually used with like surveys to help with coaches doing leadership development. But in this instance, Zane wanted to use self-directed learning principles, especially related to instructional design, to guide the development of a very complex platform that is online. He already did a pilot with me last spring or fall. It's been a long time to figure out what needed to be improved. That included interviews with a small group of people to get very specific feedback. That also included expert faculty in situated learning, self-directed learning, and instructional design to help him improve the product before it went to real world users. So part of the goal was to see if they could employ self-directed learning principles using the feedback that they received from peer raters and their managers to figure out what leadership skills they needed to develop and build out a plan for improving those skills. The research method, again, like Monica's, was qualitative. Although with Anytown, I also did qualitative, which was in a separate article. Zane wanted to figure out from the user's experience how the system could be further refined and improved in the instructional design components or the digital design components, so that the user's experience was better and the feedback was more usable, so that they can engage in better self-directed learning. And so his study was at an ophthalmologist group, I can't remember the name of the company, but you see them all over the place. They have, I think, blue and yellow signs, blue, yellow, and white in strip malls all over the place. But he did the study at, I think, 3 of them with folks working in those spaces. A lot of them were looking towards future leadership roles. They needed training. And the design of the system was to give feedback in a more automated way. Whereas with traditional leadership coaching, you have to have a human being giving you that feedback and guiding you. And it's expensive and time consuming. So part of the goal was to use the technology to reduce the time factor in this space, which is one of the benefits of using technology for learning. It's more efficient sometimes. So again, Zane conducted the analysis as lead researcher, and then we had multiple coders reviewing those codes so that he could identify some big picture themes that would lead to improvements in the system. All technological systems are perfect when we design them. All technological systems are incredibly flawed. Zane used qualitative research in order to figure out what parts of the instructional design worked and which were less successful so that he could improve them in the future. And that's really what a lot of our research is around. Sometimes it's about, like with Anytown, did they learn more? Did they not? Did the design work? Sometimes it's about what are the user's experiences with my design, or certain specific parts of the navigation of the design, like with Monica's. So there's a lot of different things that you can get to with this, and it does not just have to be, did they learn more or not? Sometimes there's other things you have to know first before you can actually build a successful instructional design. So I'm going to end this one here. Next video, I'm going to talk about the applied instructional design model, explanation of the tech ethics and environment course that I've been working on. But go ahead and take a break here. Think about all of these fun things that I have said and start the next one when you're ready.